Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played by Emanuel Lasker and Jose Raul Capablanca. This was played in the 1921 World Chess Championship match in Havana, Cuba, and this is the 10th game of the match. And the previous 9 games ended with Jose Raul Capablanca getting an extra point than Lasker. He won the 5th game, and all of the other games were drawn. So without further ado, let's see what the 10th game will bring us. Lasker starts the game off by playing the move d4. We have d5 by Capablanca, c4, and now e6. So the queen's gambit declined. Knight c3, knight f6, and now normal development by both sides. And here, Lasker shuts his bishop out of the pawn chain by playing the move e3. And that is always a good idea, especially if you can develop your bishop before you play e3, since the bishop can always be a bad piece, similar to the light squared bishop that black has. So we have castles by Capablanca, and now knight f3, knight bd7, and now queen c2. So now we've entered the classical variation of the queen's gambit declined. We have c5, trying to strike in the center, rook d1, centralizing the rook, and now queen a5, normal development. Bishop d3, Lasker is developing his bishop, and he's also having a very sneaky threat of bishop h7. In the case that Capablanca ignores the threat with something like a6, bishop takes h7 check, just simply wins a pawn, and after all of this, we could say that perhaps Lasker could be equal, or maybe he could have a chance of standing slightly better. But instead of playing a move like a6 and acknowledging the fact that the h7 pawn is hanging, Capablanca just pushes the pawn, and hence also pushes the g5 bishop away. The bishop goes to h4, and now we have a trade on d4 and a trade on c4. So Capablanca has now given Lasker an isolated queen pawn. And if we know anything about playing against isolated queen pawns, it's that we must exchange all minor pieces. So we're going to have to see how Capablanca is going to employ that strategy in this very game. So knight to b6. The knight isn't usually the best when it's placed on the b6 square, but this b6 square is only a temporary place where the knight will be. Usually you would like to put your knight in the center and mainly blockade an isolated queen pawn, which is what Capablanca is trying to do. He wants to put his knight on the d5 square, where it blockades the IQP on d4. We have bishop to b3, and now bishop to d7. Just normal development. Castles by Lasker, and now rook a c8. Pinning the knight to the queen, and now we have knight e5. Bishop b5. We have rook fe1, moving the rook away from the attack, and now knight b to d5. Putting more pressure on the c3 knight. We have bishop d5, knight d5, and now bishop e7. And after knight e7, queen b3, bishop c6. Moving the bishop back and hoping for a trade of minor pieces. And perhaps you could open up the b file. So knight c6, b c6, and now rook e5. And here, queen b6, queen c2. Ignoring the queen trade, and now we have rook f to d8. Putting pressure on the d4 pawn, and in this scenario, threatening to win it. Knight e2, and now rook to d5. Attempting to try and open up the c file, because that could be very useful for Capablanca's rook, and also because if the c pawn moves to d5, then you could also get ideas of playing knight to c6, and also black could also get ideas of playing the move knight f5. So rook takes d5, c takes d5, queen d2, and now knight to f5. So putting the knight on a very active square, and if not careful, let's say Lasker plays a move like knight f4, then he could actually just lose to back rank issues. For instance, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight d4, and if Lasker's greedy and captures the knight, then this is going to be checkmate for him. So you must be careful with what you do, and this knight f5 move is essentially tying the e2 knight down to the d4 pawn. So we have b3, instead. And now h5 by Capablanca. And Capablanca is mainly trying to prevent the idea of g4, which will essentially move the knight away from the f5 square. And of course, if you look at the position from a glance, you can already tell that Capablanca would love his knight to be on f5, and he would do anything to stop it from going away. And after h3, he plays h4. So h4 is basically saying that if Lasker ever wants to play the move g4, then Capablanca is happy to just play en passant, and he would prevent the knight from being kicked away for one extra move. So we have queen d3, and now rook c6. Trying to set up a battery with something like queen c7, and then rook c2, and who knows what that rook could do from the second rank. So we have king to f1, trying to bring the king into the game, but as you'll see after a few moves, this move becomes quite meaningless. g6, queen to b1, and now queen to b4. And here the king just goes back to g1. And this is quite strange because it looked like Lasker had some hopes of developing his king out, but it didn't go as planned. So now, what would you do here if you were playing as Capablanca? Okay, so if you came up with the move a5, then that is correct, because that is what Capablanca played. And a5 is basically trying to loosen the pawns around the queen side. And it's trying to mainly loosen the b and the a pawns. Because if you can notice, black is threatening this move a4. And a4 is, of course, trying to play the move a takes b3, and after either queen or a takes b3, you can see that Lasker is now settled with an isolated pawn on the b file. Or, if after, say, a4 is played, and white captures, then after queen captures a4, the a pawn is isolated. So basically, Capablanca is trying to get an isolated pawn for white. So we have queen b2, and now a4. So Capablanca is trying to do just that. We have queen d2, and now we have an exchange, and this happens. And now rook to b6, of course attacking the b3 pawn, and now rook to d3, defending. Rook to a6, trying to infiltrate with the a1 square. And now we have g4, trying to kick the knight away, but like I said, en passant. Now rook to a2, controlling the second rank. And this can be quite useful with restricting the white king, as the king really has nowhere to go once this rook lands on the second rank. And after knight c3, rook c2, knight d1, Lasker is a bit unsure of what he can really do, and he kind of just jumps his knight around a lot. So we have knight e7, knight c3, rook c1 check, and now king to f2. And now knight c6. And now knight d1, rook b1, king e2. Of course, you were not allowed to play the move knight c3 because rook takes b3 would be played, and that's a pawn. But here, I encourage you to pause the video and yet again try to find out a good plan that Capablanca can play. Okay, so it's really easy to tell that Capablanca is winning, and winning significantly, mainly because, Lasker's knight is not very active. Lasker hasn't really shown how he's going to develop his rook. His rook is kind of guarding the d4 pawn, and this doesn't look like a good situation. So if you came up with the move rook b3, then congratulations, and you found the move. Point being that if rook takes b3 is played, then after knight takes d4 check, then this is just losing, since after king d2, knight b3 check, and now king e3, the knight can just come to c5. So you can't accept the rook, so king e3 was played. And now we have rook b4. And we can just see that now that Lasker is also down a pawn, this is going to be even harder to find a way to draw. Knight c3, knight e7, and of course we can see the threat is knight f5 check, followed by capturing the pawn with either the rook or the knight. It doesn't matter. So we have knight e2. First of all, reinforcing the d4 square, and secondly, trying to find a way to actually activate that knight. It is a very hard piece to activate, so Lasker must try all that he can. Knight f5 check, and now the king comes back to f2. Now g5, trying to perhaps stop an idea like h4 with all of white's pawns being on dark squares. And now we have g4 and knight d6. So now we can see that there is essentially no way of stopping this d6 knight from coming into the e4 square. And this position is just too dominating for Capablanca. Knight g1. Again, Lasker is completely unsure of what he can actually do, and he's just playing around with his moves because he's not really sure what the right move is in this situation. Knight e4 check, king to f1, and now rook to b1 check. King g2, rook b2 check, king f1, and now rook f2 check. Essentially ensuring that the king is never going to pass the second rank. We have king e1, rook a2. And the king is not going to ever pass the second rank, and also it's very hard to find a way to actually activate the king or the knight. Because in this situation, if you play the move knight e2, then after the simple rook a1 check, and now rook d1, firstly you could obviously just capture the rook on d1 check, and then play knight f2 check, and this would just win the h3 pawn. But at the same time, you could also just ignore the trade of rooks, and after something like knight g1 here, perhaps even king g7 and activating the king is enough to win. So it's a very good position for Capablanca that he can choose his method of torturing Lasker. So we have king to f1 instead of knight e2, and now king g7. Capablanca chooses the approach of bringing his king out. Rook e3, king g6, rook d3, f6, rook e3. Again, Lasker is completely unsure of what he can do, so he's just moving back and forth between his moves. King f7, rook d3, king e7, and while Lasker is doing this, he's allowing Capablanca to actually advance his king. So rook g2, and now rook a2. Rook e3, and now e5. Rook to d3, and now e takes d4. Rook takes d4, and now king c5. Rook d1, d4, and now rook c1 check. Capablanca just decides to go for the move king d5, and after this move was played, Lasker resigned the game. And the second victory for Jose Raul Capablanca, and he would eventually go to win the match with 4 wins, 0 losses, and 10 draws. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.